Today's an exciting day. It's the first day of football, and I'm in purple for the Minnesota Vikings, of course, right? But it's exciting for another reason too, and that's because I'm going to be harvesting some rhubarb for the third time this season. And why is that exciting? Well, because there's not much better than a good rhubarb pie or rhubarb jam. Mix it with some berries, really almost any kind of berries, and the flavor just cannot be beat. But I wanted to share with you some really important information that I wish I'd known before I started growing rhubarb. There are two myths going around, seems like all the time, about rhubarb that today I am going to bust so that you don't need to be worried about them anymore. Hi, I'm Kim. This is Olive City Oasis in Northern California. It's September 8th today. Very, very hot already. Supposed to hit 100, but hoping it's going to cool off soon. Now, rhubarb isn't supposed to grow well in an area like mine that gets so hot and stays so dry all summer long. But, we have these things called microclimates, and so I have been experimenting with growing rhubarb all over the property, really, for the last several years. And I've got some in containers and some in the ground, some in raised beds. And I have found the place, I think, that they do the best. And so from now on, I'm going to be growing them in this one area. Now, today, we're going to go harvest. As we talk about the myths, I want to just blow out of the water for you. Over by my chicken run, facing the south, where they seem to do really well, these plants, in mostly filtered sun all day with quite a bit of shade early in the morning. Now, the first myth is that you can only harvest rhubarb once, maybe twice during the season, and that you really need to stop by, June at the latest. Is that true? It is absolutely not true. Now, many people recommend that you harvest rhubarb only through June or maybe the beginning of July. And here I am at September 8th harvesting. The thing is, you can actually harvest until your first frost. It may be that people have recommended that you do this last harvest by, the end of June, beginning of July, because near them, in their area, their frost comes kind of early, maybe at the beginning of September even. I'm not sure because I've never lived anywhere like that. But the main reason that we want to leave our rhubarb growing when it gets close to frost is because we want the root system to be taking in all the energy from the sun and storing it up for the next growing season. And so for a good month, maybe even 2 months before your frost, you want to leave the leaves alone and let the energy from the sun soak into your roots. However, the cat's here to join. However, if you have a late frost like me, my frost isn't until November, well, then you don't need to stop that early. If I stop this week, there's still going to be a good 2 months before my first frost. So you can harvest rhubarb every 4 to 5 weeks, which for most people means 3 times a season, but at least twice a season. You want to be sure that the stalks are nice and firm and upright. If they're lying on the ground, like this one over here, don't use it. Usually at that point, they're getting soft, squishy, way flexible. This one's borderline, but you don't need to worry about using borderline ones when you have plenty of great ones. So as long as they're firm and upright and the plant is still producing well, you can harvest them as long as you leave, I'd say at least 4 to 6 weeks before your first frost to give the plant a chance to, regrow and gain some energy into its roots. In case you're not familiar, to harvest, you never cut. You take your hand down at the base near the crown of the rhubarb plant, twist and pull. And if you do it right, it will come up with this little curved area, I'm not sure what to call that, that comes out of the crown. And you won't have cut into it, because if you cut your rhubarb, say right here above that area, you're exposing the stalk to bacteria invading it and causing an infection. So don't cut, twist and pull, and you'll get your nice long rhubarb stalk safely that way. As long as your rhubarb stalks are not damaged in any way, as long as they look nice and healthy and they're firm and upright, they're good to eat. Even if your leaf, this one is not a good example because it looks nice and healthy, but even if your leaf looks somewhat battered, somewhat even diseased, as long as the stalk looks super good, you're good. Now, there are 3 things that will make a rhubarb plant stop producing well. One of them would be on you, and that is if you don't give the plant adequate water. The other 2 factors, though, are really out of your control, and that is too much intense heat and, what we've already talked about, frost coming. Now, probably everyone knows that rhubarb leaves are quite poisonous and that you should avoid eating them. However, the second big myth about rhubarb is that the stalks can become poisonous. Is this true? No, it really isn't, with one minor exception. So let's talk about that now. So do these stalks become poisonous just due to the time of year? In August and September, are these stalks now as poisonous as the leaves? Or even just a little poisonous? No, they're not. So this is how it works. The leaves have oxalic acid in them, which we know is not good for us. In fact, a high dose can be lethal, although scientists basically agree that it would take you eating about 10 or 11 pounds of rhubarb leaves to ingest a lethal dose. But how did this rumor get started? Anyway, that the oxalic acid would travel down into the stalks. Well, there's only one time that will ever happen, and that is after a frost. If the leaves take a severe amount of frost cold damage, then the oxalic acid can migrate into the stalks. But we don't harvest rhubarb after the first frost. We do not harvest and eat rhubarb when we've had that kind of severe cold that could possibly cause, that reaction to take place. If it's still, like it is today, 100 degrees, I'm not really worried that this stalk has somehow had oxalic acid transferred into it because of frost damage. In fact, we don't usually get any kind of frost until December or January, but that's, beside the point. Now, oxalic acid is not just found in rhubarb. It's found in a lot of veggies. It's found in kale and spinach and beets and just a whole lot more. And a little bit is fine. I mean, even our own bodies produce oxalic acid. It's just too much that's not good. And normally, there's not any oxalic acid to any degree that's measurable or important in the stalks, only in those poisonous leaves. So unless you are harvesting your rhubarb after you've had a frost, you don't need to worry about this. The only thing you need to worry about with your rhubarb when you're harvesting before frost is, are the stalks free of disease? Are they firm and upright, not all, squishy and flexible? Because if they're mushy, that means there is some kind of disease in them, and so you don't want to be eating that. But as far as the poison goes, no, it's not there. Now, I came across just recently a quote on a website that was all about this issue, and listen to what they said. Quote, "The longer the rhubarb ripens, the more oxalic acid is produced, which is why you should only ever harvest rhubarb until the end of June." End quote. What? The end of June? That's crazy. It's not even getting to the real hot days here at the end of June. Well, I looked a little deeper, and not only were there several other bits of real misinformation on this site, but it turns out it was originally produced in Germany. Now, nothing against Germany, but I would bet that their climate is quite a bit different than here. So perhaps maybe their frosts happen a lot earlier. I don't know, but if that's the case, maybe there, where this person was writing, they do only harvest to the end of June. But that's not the case in most places in the US and in many other places around the world. So if you love your rhubarb as much as me, well, you need to be careful to pay attention to what is the climate, the conditions, the zone, the environment that your rhubarb is growing in, because that's really what's important. When do you get your frost? And that might even be different from year to year, but it helps you plan. Remember, you want to be leaving your rhubarb plant to grow, unharvested for a good 4 to 8 weeks, I'd say average of 6, before your expected first frost. And that gives it plenty of time to soak in all the energy it needs to have a good growing year next year, but give you the chance to get all the wonderful rhubarb stalks that you can before you have to stop. Got quite a pile of rhubarb here, and I believe I mentioned that you want your stalks to be 10 to 15 inches long. If they are 9 inches, that's okay. And if they're 20 inches, that's okay. What you don't want are little short stalks like this one that's only about 6 or 7 inches long, and you can see the leaf on that is still roughly crinkly, whereas when they get bigger and riper, the leaf loses that crinkliness for the most part and flattens out. So today's harvest of rhubarb is definitely going to make me at least 2 pies or maybe 4 to 6 pints of jam, maybe even more than that when I mix in the berries. So you might be tempted when you're done harvesting, before you take the stalks in the house, to cut the stalk right here at the top, getting rid of the whole leaf, get it out of the way, But that's not a good thing to do. So a little tip for you is to actually cut and leave about 2 to 3 inches of the leaf at the end of the stalk. It's actually got a name, which is crow's foot, but the reason you want to do this is twofold. First of all, like we mentioned before when we were talking about twisting and pulling, not cutting the base, you don't want to cut the stalk because that could introduce infection into it. But the second reason is because leaving the little bit of leaf at the end of the stalk will help the stalk to retain moisture. This is really important if you plan to, rather than use the rhubarb fresh, store it in your fridge for a few days. It'll do much better if it's got this little bit of leaf left on the end of it. Just remember, it is poisonous, so before you use it, cut it off and carefully dispose of it. A couple of tips or facts I wanted to mention to you that you might or might not be aware of. One is the color of your rhubarb, whether green, red, or just tinged a bit with pink, does not affect its flavor at all. It's just a sign of what variety you have. So really not important, but a lot of people just love the color of the red rhubarb more. Second, when you're harvesting, it's always a good idea to leave about 1/3 of the stalks intact on the plant so that it has a constant supply of energy coming through the leaves to its root system. If you were to take all the stalks off at any one time, you might do damage to it. You might weaken it enough that the plant can't grow back again. That's another reason to always wait at least 2 years after you've planted rhubarb before you start harvesting, and the first year do a light harvest, because you want that root ball, those rhizomes under the ground, to be firmly established before you start, regularly and heavily harvesting the plant. I also want to mention that rhubarb isn't just delicious. It's also super nutritious. It's got tons of vitamin C and plenty of fiber. Now, I mentioned that there were 3 things that can sort of reduce the productivity of your rhubarb over the course of the summer. The first being lack of water. And so you can, address that issue. Though you don't want to drown it, which I really don't have to worry about around here, you do want to give it plenty of regular water. That will help it to maintain its productivity. As far as the other 2 factors go, too much heat, that intense sunlight, rhubarb likes heat, but not too much direct, intense sun. So the way you can prevent that factor, lowering the productivity of the rhubarb plant, is thinking very carefully about where you plant it. And if you're not sure, like I wasn't, where it's going to do best in your garden or your property, well then experiment. Put some in one place, some in another, and some in a third place, and see how they do. Here, I found they really do best in this one spot where they get filtered sun, never direct sun all day. And as far as the third vector goes, which is frost putting it into productivity, well, we can't change that, of course, but we can plan around it. So if you start your harvesting as soon as possible, if you don't procrastinate like I sometimes do, and you take your first harvest as soon as the stalks are, about a foot long, well, then 4 to 5 weeks later, you can do your second harvest, and another 4 to 5 weeks later, if you don't have a really short season, you can take a third harvest, still leaving plenty of time for the leaves to draw in all the energy from the sun and transfer it down to the roots. If you procrastinate any of your harvests, then you may end up with only 2 or yikes, 1 harvest. So stay on top of that and you'll do fine. Leaving several stalks in the ground so this plant can keep growing and keep drawing in energy from the sun. Taking in this harvest now. Can't wait for pie and jam. Thanks for joining me today. And if you haven't been growing rhubarb, I hope you think about doing that now because, oh my goodness, you won't regret it. The recipes you can make, the desserts you can enjoy, even savory dishes. And if you have been growing rhubarb, maybe now you'll feel a lot more comfortable about harvesting more frequently and longer into the season and not need to be worried about poisoning yourself or hurting the plant. Now it's time for me to head inside and watch football with some of my kids and then later today, make some rhubarb pie.